I was out here working on my garden, and it got me thinking about long-term planning and basically why China is going to eventually overtake the United States in most aspects and become kind of the dominant superpower probably the next 10 years, 10, 20 years. They're already on track to do this, but it got me thinking because the main reason that I think China is going to eventually become kind of the biggest player in the world is because of long-term and strategic planning. The United States just had another election, and every time an election comes by, you see people, freaking out, especially when their candidate doesn't win. This time, women were shaving their heads and saying, if you voted for Trump, I can't even talk to you. And saying the next 4 years, all manner of things are going to happen. Of course, nothing has happened yet. But the United States, because of its election cycle, is locked in this 4-year mindset. And because of that, it's very difficult to plan long term. China, on the other hand, has a 5-year plan. Every 5 years they come up with a new plan. They have a 20-year plan. They have a 50-year plan. They have strategic goals of what they want to achieve over the long term. And I have an example of that, which actually involves Portugal, and I'll talk about it in a second. But what I've seen after living in China for so many years was that every company I worked for, everybody I talked to, always talked about kind of this long-term goal of how do we get China to be a dominant player in any aspect, whether it's oil, when I was working in the oil industry, whether it's media, pretty much any aspect of influence or control, they talked about kind of this long-term plan. And they often talked about kind of, well, we have to do this first before we can do that, before we can do that. Again, planning. And the plans would be 10, 15, 20 years. And for somebody like me, and also for, I guess, capitalists, would be the word to describe the Americans, they're always looking for how can we maximize profit in the short term in order to kind of get the most that we can out of everything. Whereas in China, we would often go into business deals at a loss or at the break-even point with the intention of strategically positioning ourselves in a country for long-term, business cooperation. And understanding that you might lose money on this specific deal today, but in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, when you are the number one supplier of whatever it is that you're supplying to that country, then you'll gain all the profit. And that will be a 10-year, 20-year, 5-year, whatever the time frame is, was the idea behind many of the business deals that we engaged with other countries when I was working in China. Specifically in the oil industry, we'd go in, I've talked about this before, we'd go in and sometimes we would start a project and we'd be at a loss or even just barely at break even, and I'd say, well, how can we operate a business like this if we don't make a profit? And they said, we will, but it's going to take time. We want to meet everybody. We want to meet the finance minister. We want to meet the minister of energy or oil minister or whatever it is. We want to meet the president, and we want to create a long-term partnership with these people and with this government. And so we might go in at a loss today, but we'll make that up in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And that mindset of patience, that mindset of building a relationship is why China has been able to succeed where others have failed, and why China will eventually become the number one kind of power in the world. And they've already accomplished that. When you look at trade, they're the number one trade partner for most countries in terms of exports. And they have created opportunities for their businesses and for their government all around the world. Whereas it seems American companies and American businesses often go in with saying, well, how can we make a profit from this? And if it's not profitable today, then we won't invest the money to make it profitable, or we won't invest the money. So a good example is what I'm looking up right now on my phone, is that the China Aviation Lithium Battery Technology, CALB, will invest around 2 billion euros in a lithium company. So it was discovered a while back that Portugal has a lot of lithium, and so companies, specifically Chinese companies, have been trying to come here and set up mines because lithium is important, obviously, in lithium-ion batteries. And this is an example of strategic long-term planning. A few years ago when I was at BYD's headquarters in Shenzhen, I walked around and I did their whole little tour, and it was pretty interesting. And they were talking about how they were going to become the largest manufacturer of EVs, electric vehicles. And that was their goal. They were pretty much neck and neck at that time with Tesla. And so they were saying we are going to outpace Tesla and produce more electric vehicles per year than any other company in the world. And they have done that. They're now the largest producer of electric vehicles in the world. And I think they produce around 2 million units, somewhere around that per year. Upwards of 2 million units per year. And Tesla is still only at like 1 million units a year. So they didn't only surpass it, they surpassed it by like a lot. And this requires strategic planning. The Chinese government realized that they don't have any resources in terms of like oil. They don't really have any oil resources in the country, something I'm familiar with because I worked in the industry. They have very limited oil resources in kind of what they've developed. They have discovered more out in Xinjiang, and they're trying to develop that, but currently their oil resources are not very developed because they don't have it. And they import most of their oil. Coal's fine, they have a lot of coal. So they have a lot of energy resources, but in relationship to oil, they don't have big natural reserves of oil like, you know, the United States or Saudi Arabia or some of these other countries that have a ton of oil. So they said we need to move away from natural resources like oil and develop what we call kind of green energy or renewable energy, which would be solar, wind, and battery technology. And they've been doing that for the last 20 years, which is why solar's so cheap now. And they add more renewable energy per year than any other country in the world, or pretty much all the countries combined in the world, because they said we need to become energy independent and we can't depend on importing oil. Essentially, it creates a weak point for the Chinese government and the Chinese, country. If their oil supplies can be cut off, then that's a weak point. So they started to invest heavily into renewable energy and specifically into batteries, into EVs. And you don't do that without strategic planning. And this is why China will win in the long run, is because they're willing to set forth a 20-year, 30-year, 50-year strategy and say, we have to work to create these kind of opportunities for us, to create stability and to create energy independence and to create income through trade and export. And this is why they're going to win. If you are only focused on 4 years, which is the United States, and in that 4-year time, half the country is working against you because they say we don't like the policies that this president is putting forward. And then as soon as a new president comes in, they overturn everything the guy did in the last 4 years, then you're never going to get ahead. You get 2 steps ahead and then you're 1 step back. 2 steps ahead, 1 step back, because the next president that comes in is completely different and has a completely different idea of how to run the government. And this is why Tesla has struggled to become what it was envisioned, right? Elon Musk has talked about Tesla being the largest EV company in the world and trying to build it out. And in the end, it's just kind of a small niche brand, to be honest. Sure, it produces cars, but nothing compared to Toyota, nothing compared to now BYD, nothing compared to any of the major manufacturers in the world. And it has such a small indent on the overall EV market when you add up everything that's happening in China. And China made that decision to say, hey, we are going to invest because we have a pollution problem, we have an energy problem, And we see a sector that we could dominate because nobody else is putting that time, energy, and effort in to build out all the things that need to be built out. And it's a large components, right? There's a lot of components. You have to have cobalt mines in Africa. You have to have lithium mines now here in Portugal, but anywhere you can get access to. You have to have the technology companies to actually build the batteries. You have to have the technology companies to actually build the cars. And all of that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. But if you incentivize your businesses, you incentivize your consumers to adopt a new technology, then you can become the leader in that space. And that's exactly what China has done in the EV space. And I think it's this long-term strategic planning, because all of that takes years and years and years. You got to go into Africa and find the cobalt mines and set up the operations. You have to come to Portugal, in this case, for this example, and set up that company. They say it should be operational in 2025 at about 15 gigawatt hours that they'll produce in terms of batteries. And they're talking about 2030, so 5 years from now, it'll be fully operational and produce around 45 gigawatt hours of batteries. And so this is a step that's a 5, 10, 15-year plan from this company with, I'm sure, the support of the Chinese government. Of course, I haven't looked that deeply into it, but I'm sure it's getting support from the Chinese government to move forward with this plan. It's being supported, obviously. And this is what Chinese companies do, is they are strategic about what they're doing for a better future. And this is not what I'm seeing in the United States. What I see is capitalistic companies, BlackRock and even Tesla and things like this, trying to capitalize and squeeze the most out of a company for the highest profit, and in the process destroying the workers, destroying the unions, destroying the things that make a country strong, because all they want is that little bit of extra profit. And that's what's going to destroy the United States. It's currently destroying the United States. And that's, in my opinion, going to be the big difference between why the United States fails and why China succeeds, is because the United States is not planning for 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, 100 years from now. It's barely planning for next year. It's barely planning for the next 4 years, let alone the next century. And what I see with China is that they do focus on that. There are people in the government saying, where should China be, and which spaces should China be investing in, and where will China as a nation and a government be in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 100 years. And that strategic planning will allow them to continue to move into new areas of technology and development, whether it's fusion, whether it's EV, whether it's some other form of technology that hasn't even really been developed yet. We'll have to wait and see. But China is focused on that and focused on the future, while many countries, including the EU, seem to be focused on things that are not going to push the countries forward or the union forward, not going to create an environment for development, whether that's technology or, well, specifically technology in this point, but is not creating the environment in which companies can grow, in which companies can experiment, in which companies can actually get the backing that they need to take the risks that may or may not pan out. But you have to have a strategic outlook. You have to have a strategic mindset in order to do that. And I see China has that, while the European Union, I don't even know whatever's going on in the European Union. And the United States doesn't have that. They leave it up to the individual companies, hoping that the companies will look for profit and seek profit modes and invest and develop those from a profit-based mindset. But when you're trying to build out an industry like EVs, you need the batteries, you need the mines, you need the cars, you need everything. You need an ecosystem in order to build it, and that's what China does. They focus on, how do we build this technology entirely? How do we build the supply chain so that the companies that want to invest in this and want to explore this technology actually have the ability to do it? And I think that's why the United States will fail because they're focused on taking the last drop, every penny they can, while China is actually focused on a strategic long-term plan. And again, bringing it back to the garden, you have to plant your crops months in advance with the hope that you'll get some sort of harvest, later. And, gardening, renovating a house, building out industries all takes planning. And I think that China just is better at long-term planning than most countries, and that's why we've seen them go from a very poor country, 70 years ago to, in terms of GDP, the largest country. So it's very interesting. What do you guys think? Do you think China is better at long-term planning and this is why they're succeeding? Or do you think there's something else involved? It's just they have a large population and therefore more minds to do more things and more bodies to do more things? Leave a comment below, because I think it really depends on strategic planning, and even a small country can do a lot if they are focused and actually moving towards a goal versus each individual company just doing whatever they think is best in whatever creates the most profit in that quarter or that year. But it's very interesting. Leave a comment below, because I'd love to hear your opinions about the United States, European Union, or China, and which one you think is better at planning for the future, and which one do you think will be the dominant player, say 10, 15 years from now, when we have more results and more time has passed. Leave a comment below, and I will see you in the next video.